What I want to do today is get further into this aggregate supply, aggregate demand model by finishing our discussion of thinking about these aggregate supply curves, and then start a very, very lengthy discussion of the aggregate demand curve. I'll spend some time thinking about the basic mechanics of the overall aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. But what we're going to do almost immediately is segue into going and peeling back the curtain and looking at the workings of the aggregate demand curve. We'll talk about the aggregate demand curve in brief. Then we'll talk a little bit about using the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, at least on a general level, on a little bit of a superficial level. And then we'll start a long discussion of examining aggregate demand much more closely. And that discussion of the aggregate demand curve is going to take multiple sessions because there are lots of things we want to get into about the aggregate demand curve. It's just going to take us a while. So that's the direction that we're headed. So recall, we talked about 3 aggregate supply curves in our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And that was one of the distinguishing features that makes it a little bit more interesting. There's a short run aggregate supply curve, which is flat, and it's covering a time horizon anywhere from a couple of months, maybe to as long as a year or even 18 months, depending on kind of what's going on in the rest of the macroeconomy. So when we say short run, we're talking about anywhere from 2 to 3 months all the way out to maybe a year and change, maybe 18 months at the outside. The distinguishing features that we pretend that prices are fixed, or rather a better way to think about that is that producers are perfectly willing to expand production at the current price level. Then we went to the medium run aggregate supply curve. This is the upward sloping one, the one that we said that actually looks like a supply curve. And this is really our supply curve for a business cycle horizon. So we're thinking, remember we talked about the business cycles lasting somewhere around 3 to 5 years. So we think about shifting around the medium run aggregate supply curve. We're thinking about the changes we're talking about taking place over that long of a horizon to actually work their way through the system. So it kind of takes over from where the short run aggregate supply curve leaves off. So it's kind of 2 to 5 years. If the economy is really overheated and people are reacting very quickly to price increases, we could see these effects going through even more quickly. But on average, we're talking about kind of a 2 to 5 year time horizon to allow things to adjust. And remember, the key distinction here with the medium run aggregate supply curve is that we're saying that output prices or final goods prices are flexible, but input prices are fixed. So when we draw any particular medium run aggregate supply curve, we can think of each medium run aggregate supply curve as being associated with a particular level of input prices. And as that level of input prices changes, we'll see the medium run aggregate supply curve actually drifting up and down. Okay. Another way to look at that I wanted to make sure that we bring up, another way to view prices in their relationship to the medium run aggregate supply curve is that the expected price level is fixed. And the reason we can say that is because we think that people make their price level expectations based in large part off of their own incomes that they experience from participating in the input markets. So a lot of people will base their wage demands off of the expected price level and vice versa. So that is informed that way. The actual output prices are flexible and may vary, so we can have actual prices deviating from expected prices, okay, which is perfectly fine. But we think that there's a connection there between input prices and expected prices. So when we say that input prices are fixed, we're also saying something about the level of expected prices. And the level of expected prices are fixed as well. So I may, from time to time, use that connection with the medium run aggregate supply curve as well. So if expected price level goes up, if you expect prices to be higher in the future, you're going to change your wage demands, change the amount that you demand for input prices, and that's going to make the curve float up and down. So in your mind, make that connection between input prices and the expected price level. We said that sloped up. It has some kind of non-zero price elasticity of supply. And then finally, we have the long-run aggregate supply. And depending on who you talk to, well, first of all, we know it's vertical. Well, I mentioned that. I didn't actually mention that. I think I showed that to you the last time we were together. So it's vertical. So it has zero price elasticity of supply. Depending on who you talk to, the long-run aggregate supply curve either covers a long time horizon, or in extreme, if you talk to certain economists, they think it's always valid. They think it's always the right supply curve. So I'm more of a person who thinks that the long-run supply curve actually does mostly apply to the long run. So it covers, 5 years plus, maybe even it takes decades, a decade or even longer for these effects that we're talking about to work their way through the system. I mean, we're abstracting from a whole lot of stuff going on in the background, and one of the things, of course, we're abstracting from that you had a little bit of experience with in the problem set is how political and other arrangements can interfere with the adjustment process in the economy. In particular, the political process can make it take a long time for the economic processes to work their way through the system. And some of you struggled with those ideas, I think rightly so, when you did problem 1 on the problem set, thinking about, there's this idea that Lowenstein was talking about in his article that oil prices should, in the long run, drop all the way down to the minimum long-run average total cost, right? And I think that's a fairly challenging idea when you think about oil for a number of reasons. One of which, of course, is political. And by political, I'm throwing in the effect of things like OPEC. So I'll put in parentheses here when we talk about long-run aggregate supply curve that we're definitely thinking about describing changes that take multiple years to work their way through the system to see their effects play out. Some economists who really believe in flexible prices think that this is actually the right aggregate supply curve at any point in time. Think that that's the aggregate supply curve all the time. Now, if you believe that, that has really interesting and very far-reaching implications for the economy, in particular what you can do to the economy as a government. We're going to not go down that path because, number one, I don't think it's really true in reality. And number two, it would take away a lot of the stuff. It would take away a lot of the stuff that we want to talk about for the rest of the semester that I think is really interesting, and we'd have to replace it with a lot of more technical, mathematical stuff that doesn't necessarily get us anywhere. So let's stick with the plan. But just keep this in mind because some of the people who believe this stuff often get editorials in the Wall Street Journal. Okay, so why is the curve vertical? We haven't really talked about that, so let's get into the explanation. In the long run, we have enough time for all prices to become fully flexible. So for whatever economic and political reasons they were fixed, some of them at least were fixed in the short run and the medium run, in the long run is long enough for all prices to be fully flexible. Okay? So again, if you are a flexible price true believer, that you think prices are always flexible all the time and can always adjust, then we're always going to be in this aggregate supply situation. For the rest of us in reality, we think that some prices really are sticky over shorter or longer periods of time, and it takes the time for the economy to actually let those prices adjust for various reasons. Could be economic, could be political. Okay. When all prices are fully flexible, then the economy can go about doing the allocation of resources so that all resources get to their most efficient usage. Okay? So if we let the price mechanism work and do its job, then everybody's going to be out there equating marginal cost to marginal benefit in every possible dimension, right? As we talked about, on the micro side, right? Everybody's out there thinking about what things look like at the margin. They're going to be adjusting the quantities in order to match the prices, and the prices will follow. So all prices are fully flexible. This means that this market system will allocate all resources in the economy to their most efficient usage, to their most efficient use. Okay? So what's going on here in the background for this vertical long-run aggregate supply curve is that the mechanism has done its job, the markets have done their job, and everything in the economy is right where it should be in terms of its most efficient usage. So that if I have to get resources from if I want to try to attract resources to my thing, my business, or my project, whatever I'm doing, I'm going to have to pay more to get those resources. And by paying more, I'm going to start triggering a chain reaction. So I'm going to have to pay more for the inputs that I get, and that's going to cause reactions with other inputs, and I'm going to start to nudge up the price level. So the implication is that if we try to attract resources away from the most efficient usage, we have to pay more. We have to pay higher prices to do that. And paying higher prices is going to lead to further adjustments, and other uses are going to compete back for the resources, and we're going to end up simply pushing the price level up without actually increasing the amount that we produce. So we'll have to pay more for the inputs, and that will trigger an adjustment to all the market prices, and make the machinery of the markets go through a new round of adjusting. And we'll find that once we're done completely adjusting again, that we'll be back where we started in terms of output, because the markets will naturally allocate resources to the most efficient place. So that'll trigger an economy-wide price hike, followed by a reallocation of resources. So basically what this is saying is that in the long run, the price level is kind of irrelevant, or doesn't have a lot of bearing. What's really relevant to production in the long run is what is the most efficient use of all the resources in the economy. And that depends on the amount of capital that we have. So it depends on the amount of resources, labor, capital, and other inputs. And it also depends on what our level of technology is. So my argument is that in the long run, if you try to monkey with the price level, all you're going to end up doing is changing the price level. As long as you let prices adjust, you let the markets work, everything's going to go to its most efficient use. Right? All the relative prices will line up so that everything gets allocated to the right place, so to speak. And it could be at a nominal price level where the index is at 100, or it could be at a nominal price level where the index is 1,000. It's completely irrelevant. So if you monkey with it, you're just going to end up with a higher or lower price level. You're going to end up with the same level of output overall. And that's the whole idea behind the long run. When you let prices adjust and the market mechanism work, everything eventually gets allocated to its most efficient usage. Price doesn't affect output. This level, I'm going to be very specific, this level of most efficient, only the amount or amounts of capital, labor, and other inputs, and the level of technology affect this most efficient level of output. So price doesn't matter. In the long run, the things that matter are, again, like in the case of the micro, we said in the micro case, the supply conditions of production determine the price level. In the aggregate case, the conditions of production in the long run determine what the output level it is, and something else determines the price. So in both cases, in the micro and the macro level, the supply curve is driven by the conditions of production. But we get two different outcomes, and I'll handle that in a second because it may lead to some cognitive dissonance here, and we'll deal with that as quickly as we can. First, let me call this most efficient level of GDP YP for so-called potential GDP. It's a little bit of an unfortunate name because it somehow implies that is the best that we can do. In reality, it's not the highest level of output we can possibly have. It's just the most efficient one. In some sense, it's our sustainable potential GDP. Right? Given a set of resources, if we let the markets work, we could get YP every period. We could hit YP and we can stay there for an indefinite period. Right? So think about YP as being our potential long-run sustainable level of GDP given a particular set of resources. So note